Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video and leaving meaningful comments. Wishing everyone good health and happiness. I am Lie Too Deep, a young woman living in a remote highland village. I married Mr. Pow when I was 18, and it has been 5 years since then. Deep was washing dishes by the well, her hands moving swiftly, but her eyes filled with sorrow. From inside the house, heavy footsteps echoed. Mr. Pow stepped out, his gaze cold. Pack your things and leave. I don't need you anymore. I've taken a second wife. Deep froze, her hands trembling, causing a bowl to slip from her grasp and shatter on the ground. She looked up at her husband, unable to believe what she had just heard. Her mother-in-law stormed out of the house, brandishing a stick. Leave now. Don't make me use force. Deep stepped back in panic. She had no time to gather anything, only the thin coat draped over her shoulders. As she walked past the gate, silent tears streamed down her face. Behind her, her mother-in-law's harsh voice still rang out. On the red dirt road, Deep walked while sobbing. Seeing her distress, the neighbors rushed over to ask what had happened. Choking back tears, she told them. They sighed, their eyes filled with sympathy. Poor girl, it's so unfair. Meanwhile, Mr. Pow sat at a feast, raising his cup with a loud laugh. I just kicked Deep out. My new wife has arrived. His friends laughed along, indifferent to the pain Deep was enduring. Deep kept walking, her legs weary, not knowing where to go. Lie Too Deep wandered aimlessly along the village road, her steps heavy, her eyes red from what had just happened. She had just been kicked out of her home by her husband, left with nowhere to go, no belongings, and no one to rely on. The sky was overcast, and a light breeze rustled through the bamboo groves along the road, carrying a chill that made her shiver. She wore only a thin coat, wrapping her arms tightly around herself, trying to suppress the storm of emotions rising within. Ahead, a tall man stepped out of the government office, holding a stack of documents in his hands. It was James, 28 years old, who had just returned to Vietnam after studying abroad and earning a master's degree in agriculture in Japan. Now, as the CEO of an agricultural company, he had come back to his hometown with the hope of helping local farmers develop their production. As soon as he landed in Vietnam, James had gone straight to the local government office to complete his entry paperwork and temporary residence registration. After finishing the procedures, he was about to leave when he suddenly noticed a woman approaching. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, her face exhausted. Deep saw James and, assuming he was an official, hurried toward him. Her voice trembled, and tears welled up in her eyes. I was just kicked out by my husband. He married another woman and is divorcing me without giving me anything. James was momentarily taken aback. He hadn't expected her to be going through something like this. A hint of sympathy flickered in his eyes, but he quickly regained his composure. I'm not an official, he said. You should go inside, they will guide you through the process. Deep froze for a moment, embarrassment flashing across her face. I'm sorry, she murmured. It's all right. James spoke gently, then gestured toward the office entrance. Deep bowed her head in gratitude before silently walking inside. James remained where he was, watching as her figure disappeared through the door. A soft breeze passed by, carrying with it a strange, unfamiliar feeling that settled in his heart. Deep stepped into the government office, her heart heavy. She gathered all her courage, gripping the hem of her shirt tightly to stop her hands from trembling. Her voice was soft but carried deep pain as she reported how her husband had thrown her out, how she had endured so much in a marriage she once believed would be her safe haven. The officials listened, their eyes showing a trace of sympathy. They carefully noted down every detail of her story. One of them spoke gently. We will resolve this as soon as possible. For now, you should go home and rest. The words, though kind, felt like a blade slicing through her heart. Go home? But where could she go? She nodded, bowed slightly, and quietly left the office. As she stepped outside the gate, she stopped in her tracks. In front of her, the bustling streets were filled with people rushing by, each with their own purpose. But what about her? Where was she supposed to go? Her home was gone, and she had no one left to turn to. She kept walking, letting the setting sun stretch long, fading rays across the pavement. The sounds of traffic and the glow of shop lights flickering on one by one surrounded her, yet everything felt distant and unfamiliar. Leaving the busy streets behind, she followed a narrow road leading toward the outskirts of town. The air grew quieter, with only the faint whisper of the wind rustling through the trees. Her weary feet dragged along the uneven dirt path. The evening breeze carried a biting chill, seeping through the thin fabric of her clothes. She walked and walked until she came across an empty patch of land by the roadside. A flat, desolate place where no one seemed to pass. Wild grass grew sparsely, scattered stones lay unevenly across the ground. No shelter, no warmth, but at least, it was somewhere she could stay, even just for now. She looked around before slowly sitting down, letting the wind tousle her already disheveled hair. Taking a deep breath, she tried to swallow the bitterness that was rising in her throat. Her trembling hands wiped away the silent tears that had been falling unnoticed. Lowering her gaze, she picked up dry twigs and cleared away the small stones around her, as if trying to carve out a tiny space for herself, a fragile refuge in this vast, indifferent world. Deep finished clearing the empty patch of land and let out a long sigh. Her back ached from exhaustion, but at least the place felt cleaner now. She sat down, brushing away a few stray strands of hair from her face, her eyes scanning the surroundings for anything that might help her get through the night. Across the road, she noticed a cluster of banana plants, their broad leaves swaying gently in the wind. She hesitated for a few seconds before standing up and hurrying over. Carefully, she broke off the largest leaves she could find. As she carried them back, the gusts of wind sent chills through her body, making her shiver. Quickly, she laid the leaves down, stacking them on top of each other to create a makeshift bedding. It was simple, but at least it would keep her from sleeping directly on the cold, damp ground. The sky gradually darkened, and the last weak rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. She glanced around. The highland winds at night were always freezing. If she had nothing to keep her warm, she wouldn't last until morning. Bending down, she picked up scattered dry twigs, carefully gathering them into a small pile. The twigs were rough and brittle, but right now, they were her only chance at warmth. Using a few dry leaves as kindling, she fumbled with a lighter. At first, the flames were weak flickers, but soon, they caught onto the larger sticks, spreading into a small fire. The flickering light cast shadows across her weary face, creating an interplay of light and darkness. She inched closer to the fire, stretching out her hands toward the warmth. The heat slowly seeped into her skin, easing the biting cold just a little. She sat there in silence, watching the flames dance in front of her. The night deepened, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying an icy chill. She pulled the banana leaves over her shoulders, wrapping them around herself. A sense of loneliness crept over her, wrapping around her tighter than the cold. But in this vast, frigid night, at least she still had the faint glow and warmth of her little fire. Deep curled up beside the small fire, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to make herself as small as possible to preserve what little warmth she could. The flames flickered and danced, casting a faint glow on her weary face. Around her, the night was eerily silent, broken only by the sound of the wind howling through the trees, carrying a biting cold that cut through her skin. She looked up at the sky, where the stars shimmered, distant and almost unreal. Never had she imagined that one day she would be left out in the open like this. Just this morning, she had still been standing inside a house. It wasn't a happy home, but at least it had a roof over her head. Now, she had nothing, and she had no idea where tomorrow would take her. Suddenly, the distant glow of headlights pierced through the darkness, cutting across the still night. Instinctively, she turned her head, her vision blurring slightly from the sudden brightness. The car slowed down and came to a stop by the roadside, its engine humming steadily. The door opened, and a tall figure stepped out. Under the dim light, she recognized him. It was James. He approached her with a calm, steady stride, his voice deep yet gentle. "Miss Deep, what are you doing out here?" Deep looked up, eyes wide with surprise. In that moment, the overwhelming emotions she had suppressed all day suddenly burst forth. Her vision blurred as tears welled up and spilled over, unstoppable. James watched her, a flicker of sympathy in his gaze. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "I saw you at the office this morning, and now you're out here alone. Are you okay?" Deep took a deep breath, struggling to control her trembling voice. She wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, her voice hoarse. "I have nowhere else to go." James fell silent for a moment, as if contemplating something. The cold night wind ruffled his hair slightly. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but sincere. "If you don't mind, you can stay at my place. It's too cold out here." Deep stiffened in surprise. The offer was so unexpected. He was just a stranger she had met that morning. How could she possibly accept? She shook her head, her voice hesitant. "Thank you, but we barely know each other. I don't want to be a burden. I'll be fine here." James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He understood her reluctance, her wariness. He didn't want to push her, so he could only sigh and nod slightly. "Then I'll come back tomorrow. If you need anything, just let me know." He stood up, adjusted his coat, and cast one last glance at her before turning back toward his car. The sound of the car door closing echoed in the quiet night. The vehicle slowly pulled away, its headlights fading into the distance, leaving behind nothing but darkness. Deep watched until there was nothing left to see but the pitch-black night. The wind continued to howl, the cold seeping deep into her bones, creeping into the empty spaces within her heart. The fire still burned, but it no longer felt strong enough to ward off the chill closing in around her. She curled up tighter, pulling the banana leaves around herself in a desperate attempt to hold on to whatever warmth remained. Her body ached with exhaustion, her eyelids growing heavier. Slowly, she surrendered to sleep, drifting off into the silent night, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring.